I'm Alan Tansman, director of the Townsend Center for the Humanities, and I'm here to introduce today's event and very quickly get out of your way. I should say, I stand here unabashedly as a fan who teaches literature, but I think would never teach one of your novels out of nervousness. I don't know what. I first read Housekeeping in 1980 in Kyoto, Japan. A friend who's sitting right there, and I felt that we had discovered the novel, and then we gave it away far and wide as if passing around some beautiful jewel. The feeling of magical drifting melancholy matched our sensibilities in that time and place, and maybe at age 19 we felt like girls drifting around some alien land. It's many years later, and I've read everything Marilynne Robinson has written, her essays and her fiction. When I read her, I find myself moving across her words very, very slowly, wondering why there's a but here and not an and there, why a comma and not a semicolon, why a shadow, why a patch of sunlight, why a person walking this way and not walking that way. Her 2008 novel, Home, which I read 6 years ago, drifts often into my mind from distilled in the image of the troubled character Jack moving under the lintel of a door. I don't know what this means, really, but that's the image that comes floating into my mind. As for her 2004 Gilead, the feeling of being too directly addressed discomforted my atavistic Jewish soul and made me begin the novel again and again. When finally I was able to read it through, I came to feel addressed from a place beyond the particular language of its preacher-narrator. I apologize for these very personal responses. They are the best way I can think of to introduce Dr. Robinson, a writer you all know so well already. A writer one loves comes to feel like one's private property, but of course she belongs to the world. I should perhaps say then that Dr. Robinson was born in Idaho and has been awarded the Pulitzer Prize for fiction as well as the National Humanities Medal. Her new novel Lila, is just out. I'm halfway through watching Lila's transformation. For me and for many others, reading Dr. Robinson's work is an aesthetic and also a spiritual experience, if not a Christian experience for me. This evening at 6 in this very room, she'll be joined by Berkeley faculty members Bob Hass, Dory Hale, and Jonathan Sheehan for a discussion about religion and the art of the novel, and I hope you'll join us. We'll hear then perspectives on her work by a poet, a literary theorist, and an historian. Today, Dr. Robinson will speak about Shakespeare and the question of audience, and our marvelous scholar of Shakespeare, Jeff Knapp, sitting somewhere, will then offer a brief comment, after which we hope there will be time for conversation between them and you. Jeff is a prolific author, most recently of Shakespeare Only, in which he asks the question, is Shakespeare one of a kind? He's recently written a great piece about Citizen Kane, which I've read, and I've been honored to be his colleague and I've learned immensely from him. Dr. Robinson's visit is being sponsored by the Townsend Center along with the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, a wonderful, fairly new program that's trying to reach across departments and disciplines to think about religion in our life and in our work. This kind of co-sponsorship is rare and speaks to the breadth of Dr. Robinson's work, and I want to thank Jonathan Sheehan, sitting there, who's the director of the center, for his efforts in getting this event going. Dr. Robinson is here as our Avenali Lecture, and in closing, I want to say something about the Avenalis, and some of you have heard this. Peter Avenali was a young man during the Great Depression. His Berkeley education cost him $25 a semester, a price that included tickets to Cal football games. I think box seats are hundreds of thousands of dollars now, I gather. The son of an Italian immigrant, Peter graduated from Berkeley with a degree in English literature, went to Harvard Business School, and then to war. He spent 4.5 years in the Army, serving time on the front lines, including at the Battle of the Bulge, in which some 19,000 Americans died. Joan, his wife, a graduate of Sarah Lawrence College, was in the Navy working as a radio operator in Madison, Wisconsin when she met Peter. They married after 4 dates in 1945 during Peter's 30-day leave from the Army, and they honeymooned in Lake Tahoe. I don't know anything about the rest of the story, and perhaps it's one that Marilynne Robinson could someday write for us. So with that, I introduce you. It's a pleasure, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Can you hear me? I know that my voice is perhaps softer than the previous voice you've been hearing. I actually did a PhD, and the subject of the PhD was actually Shakespeare. And over years of time, I have been reading history reading original primary source documents to the extent that I can get them, and so on. And with the internet now, of course, it's amazing what you can get. But my interest in early American literature is an interest in the culture that produced the generation that wrote in that, in that spirit. And my interest in Shakespeare, of course, is in the period before the English Civil War, which actually sent a very large flood of immigrants into New England, so that the culture that had failed to take hold in England became the dominant culture in New England, in Massachusetts particularly. So since all of these things are of interest to me, and I've done a reading in all these areas, I'm surprised at how seldom people who specialize in early American literature or culture show any interest in the English Renaissance, which is historically contiguous, culturally simultaneous. And conversely, I'm amazed at how little of the arc of English history that was carrying the civilization Shakespeare lived in towards Civil War is consulted by people who write about Shakespeare. I say this on the basis of having had academic training and having had, some acquaintance with how these things are approached. Anyway, so I'm writing, here we go. I mean, the first two paragraphs are blatantly incendiary, but I hope to raise questions, because I think it's time that we ask some pretty thoroughgoing questions about how we approach history. Lately, I've been reading Jonathan Edwards' A Life by George Marsden. It is admirable for its respectful treatment of Edwards' theology and the piety that lies behind it. But the book is most interesting to me at the moment for a fault I find with it, one that makes it a good recent example of an abiding, seemingly universal peculiarity of Renaissance English and American colonial historiography. That is, an utter obliviousness to the fact that they are profoundly interrelated. Marsden uses the word Puritan as if we all know what that means, Calvinist the same, that these words had an eventful history before they reached these shores, a fact that can only be crucial to any understanding of them, is nowhere even suggested. For example, he seems to think American Puritans would have had to look to France and the Catholic treatment of Huguenots for an example of religious intolerance, when, after the restoration of the monarchy and the Anglican Church, Puritans in England, along with Catholics, were denied basic civil rights into the 19th century. He treats Edwards' association of religion and the secular state as if it were a peculiarity of his thinking, when since the Treaty of Augsburg in 1555 it had been a dominant pattern in Europe, as it certainly was in England after Henry VIII broke with Rome in 1534. That the fact as well as the manner of British-American colonization is significant in larger cultural terms is hardly suggested. It would be the same as historical method if one were to assume that a given number of blonde people finding themselves on the coast of Australia spontaneously took up self and mutual shackling and penal servitude. John Fox's Book of Martyrs is mentioned once by Marsden in a context that implies that it reflects a New England fascination with grisly death, in contrast to what he calls the polite English, apparently unaware that the famous martyrology is altogether English and a prehistory of the English Civil War and Puritanism in North America. Then again, he takes no notice of the English Civil War. He alludes to the stark mnemonics of the New England Primer without mentioning the fact that it was assembled and printed by an Englishman briefly in America and had long use in Britain. Though he uses the word Calvinist with a readiness he did not learn from Edwards, there is no sign that he has read a word of Calvin. Instead, he dwells on the Puritan belief in hell and damnation as if it were peculiarly and definitively Calvinist, as if there were Christians anywhere on earth at the time who did not believe in them and dwell on them graphically, Calvin less than others. The book is massively dependent on previous scholarship, which is understandable. That it should be so exclusively dependent on it means that it repeats the errors and omissions that are canonical in this field. I have been fascinated for a long time by historical amnesia. That it should be so preponderant in periods as intensely studied as the English Renaissance and colonial New England should raise serious questions about what history is and what scholarship does. So late in my life, I have learned that the theological writings of John Wycliffe survive in significant numbers, a substantial part of them never to this day translated from his Latin. My interests being what they are, I have done more than most people to put myself in the way of knowing this, but the discovery came as a complete surprise to me. I was aware of Wycliffe's influence on Huss and Luther, assuming that the example of the 14th century vernacular Bible associated with him was the reason for his importance to them and to the Reformation in general. Now I have a collection of Wycliffe's and his followers' writings published in the valuable Masters of Western Spirituality series, and I find there is much more to be surprised about. Despite its obvious importance, the treatment of religion by historians and critics as an element in the English Renaissance is odd and unsatisfactory. First, the influence of earlier Reformation and Renaissance on the continent, especially in France, tends to go unmentioned before the massacres of St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572. This is true despite the fact that the French Reform was indisputably the greatest contemporary influence on religious thought and literary culture in Renaissance England. Second, though they arose among Oxford scholars and were influential in the universities, dissident movements in England tend to be dismissed by historians and critics, including our contemporaries, on the basis of polemical associations with the lower orders. Peasants in the case of the Lollards, shopkeepers in the case of that important group history has taught us to call Puritans. Of course, it is very much to the credit of both Lollards and Puritans that there were a great many peasants and shopkeepers among them, as well as scholars and aristocrats. But these associations with the lower orders tend to obscure the fact that in both cases, the impetus they gave to the culture was literary and intellectual. Worse, these conventional views of Lollards and Puritans are effectively dismissive on grounds that should themselves have been discredited long ago because they enlist the historical enterprise in a hermeneutics of snobbery, neither more nor less. In 1394, 12 Lollard conclusions were anonymously posted on the door of Westminster. They are objections to the special spiritual status claimed for the Catholic priesthood, to priestly celibacy, to the doctrine of transubstantiation and the veneration of the host, to exorcisms, to the holding of clerical and secular offices simultaneously, to prayers for the dead that give preference to those who have left money for this purpose, to icons as encouraging practices amounting to idolatry, to auricular confession, to manslaughter in war or through judicial process, to celibacy of women religious, to the costly material elaboration of the churches. The leading humanists of the Reformation, men of great learning, raised objections very similar to these more than a century later. In other words, we know enough about this sect, despite all efforts to suppress and destroy it, to see that it was intellectual as well as popular, neither of these excluding the other. From the 13th century until the 18th century, Western civilization expended enormous wealth and energy in suppressing ideas that were considered by religious and political authorities to be disruptive or heretical. Lollardy, the movement associated with Wycliffe, which continued and grew after his death, moved Henry IV and his parliament to pass De Heretico carborendo, a law whose object was to destroy the sect entirely. The law required that their books be surrendered, that their preaching and teaching cease, and that those who persisted in this heresy should be burned, in order that, quote, such punishment might strike fear into the minds of others. It is striking how certain words meant to stigmatize do have this very potent effect over centuries, Lollard and heretic being two excellent examples. The extraordinary severity of the punishments suffered for heresy, defined by its prosecutors as the entertaining of questions and opinions different from those taught by the Church, has caused heretics to be thought of as egregious misanthropes and fanatics. But the beliefs of the Lollards or Wycliffites are so unobjectionable, at least to those who consider it no crime to read a Bible in English or to doubt certain doctrines and practices of medieval Catholicism, that allusions to them stand little chance of being noticed by modern readers. Lollards believe that the image of God in any human being, themselves included, is properly the basis for all Christian life and worship, as well as charity and personal integrity. Charity should go directly to the needy poor. Confession should be made directly to whomever one has wronged. This made them regard themselves as sufficient to the requirements of Christianity and capable of its joys, with minimal dependence on the rites of the Church, including even for the sacraments of marriage and baptism. Their piety centered on the Ten Commandments, enlarging on them to make them the core of a strongly articulated ethics and ecclesiology. Suppression tends to obscure evidence of its own failures, since fear is as likely to inspire ingenuity and stealth as it is compliance. Lollardy persisted in England until it merged with the Reformation. The Protestant writer John Bale, in his preference to the examinations of Anne Askew, written in 1546, the year of the young woman's death at the stake, says, "Great slaughter and burning hath been here in England for John Wycliffe's books ever since the year of our Lord 1382, yet have not one of them thoroughly perished. I have at this hour the titles of 143 of them, which are many more in number." In England, literature in the vernacular, at least from the time of John Wycliffe, is associated with religious dissent. For this reason, I propose the concerns and the loyalties of the movement crossed the lines of class and economic status. To challenge the dominance of Latin was to diminish the potency of a great distinction among social strata. Benefit of clergy, that is, some acquaintance with Latin, could save one from hanging. It was also to broaden access to knowledge and understanding of the texts that were said to provide the theological basis of the existing order. Again, though the word Lollard was derisive, suggesting the speech of the uneducated, Wycliffe, an Oxford professor, was supported by Oxford faculty and members of the gentry and nobility, including John of Gaunt, the father of King Henry IV. Geoffrey Chaucer was associated with figures called the Lollard Knights or Hooded Knights, adherents and protectors of the sect's preachers. Some of these knights were also close to Richard II, a fact that sheds interesting light on Henry IV's attempts at suppression. Certainly, it demonstrates that the sects having adherents in the highest ranks of society did nothing to secure its safety or its acceptance. Though the emphasis of the critique offered by the movement fell largely on evil in the form of the impoverishment of the lower classes by an abusive established order, nevertheless, some who enjoyed privileges of that order seem to have seen beyond their own worldly interests. Despite whatever wisdom is contained in our darkest hermeneutics, this does happen. Many of the surviving Wycliffe Bibles are beautiful and would have been costly, the property of wealthy people. Yet the movement was much broader than its learned and aristocratic expressions. The Piers Plowman tradition arose at this time and flourished for generations until the boy who followed the plow could serve as William Tyndale's ideal reader. The English vernacular movement had its great resurgence in the Renaissance, which was simultaneous with the Reformation and hardly to be distinguished from it. This time, the Forbidden Bible in English translation was William Tyndale's New Testament, and when it arrived, the Geneva Bible as well. Under Mary Tudor, the De Heretico Carborendo, in relative abeyance under Henry VIII and Edward VI, was again enforced. People in those days were, of course, inured to horrors. There were always plenty of decapitated heads on London Bridge. English monarchs were never at a loss for means to terrorize and execute, and suppression and extermination of sects as government policy was hardly novel in England or Europe. So this return to the burning of heretics might not have had the impact it did if it had not called up an earlier era, extraordinary for the literature it left and inspired, a rich religious and secular literature written in the popular tongue. The second largest selling book of the 16th century in England was Fox's Book of Martyrs. This continuously larger, beautifully printed and illustrated compendium of accounts of the suffering and death of the heroes of dissent made an unbroken narrative of executions of 14th century Lollards and 16th century Protestants. The exhumation and burning of the remains of John Wycliffe is as vividly realized as the famous torture and burning of the young gentlewoman Anne Askew. My intention is to open the question of the mindset of Shakespeare's audience, a self-selecting crowd of Londoners with no more in common than a free afternoon and the price of admission. The argument that Shakespeare was actually someone else, the Earl of Oxford, say, is based on his apparently extensive knowledge of court life. But what we know of court life is largely what Shakespeare tells us about it. And for the most practical reasons, the knowledge that was actually crucial to him was the kind that would make his plays intelligible and engrossing to his public. This would place him closer to the man or woman in the street than to more rarefied circles, a perspective that would have come naturally to him if Shakespeare was Shakespeare. Obviously, his career depended on his making a sound estimate of their interests and capacities. And here we are, centuries on, granting him more weight and subtlety than we grant any theologian or philosopher, on the basis of his estimate of his audience. There seems to be an assumption among critics that the deep parts of his plays were written for that small class trained in the universities or sophisticated by some other means, while the groundlings were there for the clowns and the sword fights. But what if there was an intellectual tradition shared by Shakespeare and his larger audience, so strong and well established that it was capable of serving as a medium for ideas of great complexity, yet so long stigmatized as subversive or heretical, and still, rightly, so much a source of anxiety to those in power that allusions to it are oblique and implicit? What if this tradition, unacknowledged by modern scholars and critics, was a robust conceptual frame brought to the plays by the audience and shared and explored by the playwright? As the merest aside, I will mention here that the writer most widely read in England while Shakespeare wrote was the French theologian John Calvin. Considering the variety of Protestantisms already active on the continent, it is striking that Calvin should have had so singular an appeal among the English. This must in part reflect the fact that he was translated early by important figures, notably Thomas Norton and Arthur Golding. Thomas Norton, who translated the Institutes from Latin, was one of the writers of the early history play Gorboduc, performed at the Inns of Court for Queen Elizabeth. Arthur Golding, uncle by marriage to the Earl of Oxford, best known now for his translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, was also an important translator of Calvin's sermons and commentaries from French and Latin, including a 2-volume commentary on Psalms. Golding's Metamorphoses, of course, is the book most frequently alluded to by Shakespeare after the Bible, typically the Geneva Bible. And there were a number of important printers and booksellers in London at this time who were French Protestant refugees, his first publisher being one. More important, I would suggest, is the similarity between Lollard or Wycliffite theology and Calvin's theology, notably in their interpretation of communion or Eucharist. Many critics, taking transubstantiation to be the one understanding of the sacrament that realizes the presence of Christ in the supper, repeat the canard that for Protestants the rite is symbolic only. In fact, the rejection of transubstantiation had to do with the role it asserted for priests, the teaching that they uniquely are capable of making the presence of Christ real, in effect interposing themselves between the faithful and the Lord's gift of himself. The Reformed theologian Karl Barth describes Calvin's conception of the Eucharist as of a high and holy mystery. Says Barth, we must listen to the words. We are told to take, and that means that it is ours. We are told to eat, and that means the other thing that we cannot see or take or eat becomes one substance with us. The whole force of the sacrament, says Calvin, lies in the word, given for you, shed for you. Those who take in the language of the sign truly take the thing signified. A poem attributed to the young Queen Elizabeth expresses the same understanding. Hoc est corpus meum. 'Twas Christ the word that spake it, the same took bread and brake it, and as the word did make it, so I believe and take it. I pause over this because Puritanism especially is treated as having been a stripping away of the poetics of the traditional faith out of some supposed shopkeeperish impatience with the beautiful. This notion, in turn, occludes the indisputable fact that much of the literature and poetry of the English Renaissance was the work of people who were Puritans and Calvinists. Here I will mention only Spenser and the Sidneys, Milton and Marvell, though it is relevant to remember that Arthur Golding translated a tragedy of Abraham Sacrificing, the first play written on the model of a classical drama in modern European language. Its author was Théodore de Bèze, Calvin's closest associate in Geneva. The play went through 23 editions in the 16th and 17th centuries. Calvin himself was a famous stylist in French and Latin, though the way historians and critics speak of him makes his reputation for eloquence seem an anomaly. His dozens of volumes might as well have predestination and depravity inscribed in black letter on every page for all the information these scholars offer or have that might be more sufficient to the subject. In any case, it is true that the arts of English Renaissance culture were markedly weighted toward the literary rather than the visual. A dispassionate appraisal might not find the world poorer for this fact. To say that Calvin was widely read is by no means to say that everyone who read him agreed with him, nor is it to say that there was a considerable overlap of his readership and Shakespeare's audience. Still, it seems arbitrary to dismiss the significance of this readership. The society was moving towards civil war, and the insurgent and militarily successful side were called Puritans or Calvinists or Roundheads. The last a derisive term for the lower classes. This would imply that Calvinism was popular in the way Lollardy was popular also, despite and because of the learning and prestige of their great theologian and the power of his thought. The affinity between Wycliffe and Calvin, Lollardy and Calvinism is strong enough to permit the thought that Calvinism, from an English popular point of view, was less an innovation than a restoration, a boldly public assertion of beliefs it had been perilous to utter for generations. The source of this affinity is not obvious. I know of no mention of Wycliffe by Calvin, though if Huss and Luther were aware of him, no doubt he was aware of him too. In some sense, Wycliffe and Calvin may have had a common source. The Reformers were not the first European critics of priestly celibacy or of transubstantiation. Long before the Reform, there were the Waldensians in Italy and southern France, a persecuted egalitarian sect whose piety, like the Lollards, was formed around vernacular Bibles, and who also merged with the Reformation. Before Calvin joined the Reform, his cousin, Pierre Robert, had made a new translation of Scripture for the Waldensians. Since celibacy and transubstantiation became doctrine and dogma only in the 13th century of the life of Christianity, isolated communities or groups committed to another experience of the Church might have continued to adhere to the customs and teachings of these earlier centuries. The claim these movements made to having origins in the primitive Church, often dismissed as crude biblicisms, may have had a real basis. When beliefs are driven underground, it is difficult to gauge their actual importance. When their adherents are persecuted, they tend to scatter, taking their faith with them into new territories and populations, as, for example, the Huguenots in Renaissance London had done. It is broadly assumed that the Elizabethan population subscribed to an ideology that enshrined the existing order of things. I have seen a recent history that invokes in all seriousness E.M.W. Tilliard's old variant of A.O. Lovejoy's Great Chain of Being. Tilliard asserts that the resourceful Elizabethan mind simply could not think beyond the manifest goodness and necessity of the divinely established hierarchy that ordered not only physical nature but also human social and political relations. Again, this was a society drifting towards civil war, toward the startlingly modern trial and execution of a reigning king. In their own recent history, the English had seen repeatedly that notionally hereditary monarchy, with all its uncertainties and complications, could and did untune the string of social order to disastrous effect. Shakespeare opens his first history play with the hero king, Henry V, dead on the stage, leaving as successor an infant who would live into adulthood yet never really come of age. The conquests in France, which were unsustainable in the plays and in fact, left England overextended and impoverished without authoritative leadership. In more recent history, the boy King Edward VI died too young to have left an heir. His half-sister Mary, whose father had declared her and his daughter Elizabeth illegitimate in order to bar them from succession, did succeed Edward, and in turn left no heir. Monarchies and dynasties in dissolution, the disintegration of powerful persons, are subjects to which Shakespeare returns persistently. If there was a divinely ordained and inviolable order of things, it was in fact violated so continuously and so profoundly as to disappear in the endless turmoil of the actual world. It is hard to imagine how God's will could be inferred from a system that at best constantly threatened collapse, even while it sustained a violent order. When Charles I invoked the sacredness of hereditary succession at his trial, his judges could reply that half the kings of England after the Norman conquest were not in fact lawful heirs to the throne. I will concede that William Shakespeare might have looked in at a bear baiting. With a little difficulty, I grant the possibility that he sometime danced around a maypole. But I draw the line at the thought that he, the most brilliant mind in a brilliant age, could have given a moment's actual credence to a Tilliardian great chain of being. A God-ordained social order intrinsic to reality, like the relative status of oysters and angels. Certainly this view of things is not to be found in Wycliffe or Aristotle, in Raleigh, or even in Hooker. The list of writers in whom it is not affirmed or reflected would be very long, but one or two are sufficient to dispel the notion that Elizabethans could only imagine the world in these terms. And one on any list should be Elizabeth herself. She said, "I know the inconstancy of the people of England. how they ever mislike the present government and has their eyes fixed upon that person that is next to succeed, and naturally men be so disposed, more to adore the rising than the setting sun. On the subject of royal authority, John Calvin wrote, "Earthly princes deprive themselves of all authority when they rise up against God. Yea, they are unworthy to be counted among the company of men. We ought rather to spit in their faces than to obey them when they spoil God of his right." In other words, we can't assume that he was the royalist he's sometimes said to be, oddly enough. Some in this audience might suspect me of wanting to make a Calvinist of Shakespeare. I would if I felt that there was good evidence to justify it, though never without reservations. I think it is more faithful to what we can know to think of him as broadly and impartially engaged in a period of then unprecedented intellectual richness, testing one idea then another. His subscribing to a single theological system and adhering to it would seem to me to be out of character. I would argue that there are important Calvinist elements in Hamlet, and I note that the figures in Cymbeline, who want to end England's ancient tributary relationship to Rome, as mutatis mutandis, Wycliffe urged they should, and Henry VIII saw to it that they did, are grasping scoundrels. The plays could be reformist in that they never treat virginity as a thing to be valued in itself, only as a kind of fidelity and anticipation of marriage. There is the matter of Sir John Oldcastle, a friend of Henry V in his youth, who led a Lollard rebellion against the king and was hanged and burned for it. Oldcastle is the name Shakespeare first gave to Falstaff, strangely enough, given the Lollard knight's famous courage in war and his piety. He is among Fox's martyrs, emaciated in the woodcut of him. Clichés of English life in Shakespeare's period feature a great deal of rollicking and ale quaffing and lute strumming. These images stand in the place of the cultural and intellectual life of the Elizabethans, those theology-reading generations, possessed, as many of them were, discreetly or secretly, of beliefs they might die for. But there must have been street preaching and disputation and sailors' tales of alien gods and unimagined coasts, and pamphlets and ballads and books of every kind passed hand to hand among those for whom literacy was a new privilege. Troops of actors passed through the country performing plays meant to advocate religious reform. There was the return of the Marian exiles, the hundreds of Protestants who had gone to the continent to reformed communities in Geneva, Antwerp, Frankfurt, and elsewhere to escape the persecutions of Catholic Mary, and who brought back the thought and experience of the Reformation in Europe, as well as the epical Geneva Bible, which they assembled and printed while in Geneva. If Shakespeare's eye now and then wandered from the text to the margins of this smuggled volume, he found a compendium of interpretation drawn from the leaders of the Reform, British and European. Perhaps he could not have done anything more radical at the time than to stand aloof from the claims of all these contending loyalties. At the same time, what could have been of greater interest to a dramatist than to see them embodied and articulated with the resources of thought and language brought into play, and the blindnesses and unacknowledged motives revealed that enabled or undercut their exponents? The misconstrued Latin and the random scraps of learnedness in his comic scenes must reflect this period in which the printed book rather abruptly assumed such importance in the consciousness of ordinary people. Shakespeare's dramatizations of stories from North's Plutarch, the Chronicle histories, Gower, and the rest would be an exploitation of these excitements. I am assuming that effective repression of political as well as religious ideas would have been impossible in the culture of the time, and that the horrors of the public executions of Protestants under Mary and Catholics under Elizabeth were meant to accomplish what public authority could not. Friends, the like-minded, the inebriated, the aristocratic, could no doubt say what they thought among themselves without great fear of consequences. And Shakespeare could watch and listen, thinking his own thoughts, his sympathies offered as a moment invited them. As for these thoughts of his, it occurred to me to consider the figure of the servant in his plays as a sort of sightline for the audience I propose. The word servant carries a very strong charge in Christian theology. Wycliffe writes of a servant God. If the phrase is a little startling, I think most Christian traditions would be willing to endorse it. The differences among them, however embattled, generally come down to differences of emphasis. So if, as I suggest, there are theological or political elements that recur with important consistency in Shakespeare's plays, bearing in mind his speaking within the conceptual terms and also within the experiential world of his audience, servants on stage would have had more interest and meaning than might be apparent to a modern audience. In those days, anyone who could have servants kept as many as he could afford to maintain. A great many people were or had been servants. They would have had relatives and friends who were servants. Masterless men of the lower orders were treated as vagrants, a criminal class subject to branding and hanging, and this would have given many of the poor reason to seek out and remain in the role of servant, however notional, as Shakespeare and his company were obliged to do. Then, too, the conventional manners that reinforced deference and were the common coin of flattery imposed at least the pretense of humility and obedience throughout society. Shakespeare establishes at some length that the bonnet-doffing waterfly Osric is a wealthy man, spacious in the possession of dirt. Peers were, ideally, servants of the king or queen, the monarch's servant of the commonwealth, priests of the church and faithful, lovers of their idealized beloved, and everyone of Christ, who took the form of a servant and made himself subject to death. So the language and conventions of servanthood were pervasive and value-laden. At the same time, while for some these conventions were largely a form of politesse, for most they were tedium and drudgery. Worse, the most brutal and shameful acts seem to have been relegated to servants, leaving the possibility of denial or of guilt to Henry IV in the death of King Richard, to King John in the supposed death of Prince Arthur, to Ferdinand in the death of the Duchess of Malfi. The speaker in Shakespeare's Sonnet 58, in the voice of a slave or vassal, clearly that of a serving man, says, "I am to wait, though waiting so be hell, not blame your pleasure, be it ill or well." This metaphor relies on the fact of the morally ambivalent circumstances of the servant, frequently an issue in the plays. The servant is required to be loyal and obedient to, and is deeply dependent on, a master who might put him to uses that are contrary to his own moral feelings and to the good of his own soul, and in doing so might expose him to revenge or to the rigor of the law. Wycliffe and his followers had an answer for this, asserted in their vernacular moral teaching. The subordinate was indeed guilty who carried out an order to do a sinful thing or who consented to sin, that is, who did not object to or strongly oppose sinful behavior in a superior. Among all the sins by which the fiend beguiles, none is more subtle than this consent, but cowardice and lack of love for God makes us start back from doing so, that is, refusing consent, as traitors do. That's John Wycliffe. This kind of teaching is the consequence of the dignity and value of the human person in Wycliffite thought, without reference to status or condition. Wycliffe wrote that though, according to the philosophers, friendship occurs between equals or near equals only, quote, the simple response is that humanity is in its nature equal. This is in a context which asserts the apostles were the friends of Christ, no less. In a gloss on the commandment, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, a Wycliffite writer says, We should know first that both prayer and speech have more to do with action than with words spoken by the mouth. Every man on earth bears the name of God printed in his soul, for otherwise he might not have being. So when any man abandons what he should do, or does what he should not do, on pain of the hate of God, he takes his holy name in vain. For no man is ordained to any purpose but to serve God, and he must take his name if he has being, and so he takes his name in vain when he fails in achieving his proper purpose. Society has its hierarchies, but in reality, everyone has the same master. Wycliffe wrote, "One can be saved without obedience to someone superior, since obedience does nothing unless it leads one in obedience to the Lord Jesus Christ. But without obedience to Christ, no one can be saved." The authority of, end of quote, the authority of earthly masters seems to have been reinforced by oaths. Lollards forbade oaths. Loyalty to Christ might bring down affliction. This was a thing Lollards were always ready to accept. Let us say no more than that Lollard thinking had had an influence over time on the thinking of England at large, and more particularly on those who felt the condition of subordinate or servant without the compensations that would have come with being served in turn, groundlings in a word. Or let us say that these teachings reinforced a sense of things congenial to the English people more generally. Then the issue of individual moral dignity and circumstances that would penalize its expression would have been live, even pressing, since this very dignity meant their souls were at stake when obedience to an earthly master would have put them at odds with the will of God. John Webster's dark play, The Duchess of Malfi, turns on the pathological obedience of Bosola to Duke Ferdinand, who, in his own defense, can plausibly claim to be mad. Othello is another version of the destructive power of a trusted subordinate. In light of the dependency of anyone having servants on their loyalty and discretion, that is, in light of the master's vulnerability to the effects of a servant's disloyalty and indiscretion, or his uncritical obedience, these relationships must have been at least as complex as marriages. Servanthood is strongly foregrounded in King Lear, Cymbeline, and The Winter's Tale. In each of these plays, disobedience motivated by a higher loyalty is central to the drama. The Duke of Kent takes the form of a servant, disguising himself as what he is in fact, dutiful and loving as would become an ideal liegeman, in order to continue to attend on and protect Lear even after he has been banished by him. In the horrific scene of the blinding of Gloucester, only a servant has the courage or the moral sense to attempt to intervene. Other servants, at peril to themselves, care for the old man's injuries and arrange his escape. The dying thought of the superserviceable Oswald, servant to Goneril, is to attempt to ensure that the letter she has entrusted to him will be delivered. His obedience, a consent to evil in Wycliffite terms, in contrast to the refusals of the other servants whose disobedience is true to their consciences and would mitigate the evil being done. Cymbeline depends altogether on the refusal of a servant to obey in order to kill his master's wife. In The Winter's Tale, Camillo refuses to murder a king who is a guest in the house of in the court of his master, King Leontes. Another servant carries out the king's order to leave an infant to die of exposure. He loathes the act, which is to say that he is violating his own conscience in doing it, and he is famously and remarkably killed by a bear, and eaten by it too. As bad befalls the ship he came in. Even Pym and Pistol, half the ragtag entourage of Falstaff, recoil from his scheme to seduce two wives of Windsor for access to their husband's wealth, and plot to defeat him in it, his little page assisting. Pistol will not become Sir Pandarus of Troy. Nym will keep the behavior of reputation. Literal servanthood being a widely shared condition, and the expectation of loyal subservience being a powerful social norm, nevertheless, to obey is a complex moral choice, equally so when peers or people are forced to decide to whom their obedience is owed. This is an issue that brought England to disaster in the 15th century, the period of Shakespeare's history plays, and more recently threatened or haunted the country in the persons of Lady Jane Grey, Mary Queen of Scots, the Earl of Essex, and other less significant claimants and pretenders. On the other hand, the servants who are faithful and comforting to Webster's Duchess and to Cleopatra, to the boy Arthur, to the imprisoned Richard II, and to Lear as well, bring the audience into the drama, enacting the kindness the audience feels toward these desperate and bewildered souls, the selflessness of ideal servanthood, even as they make the sufferers more sympathetic by revealing them as they are in their private and intimate lives. These servants are deeply normative figures, figures of grace. The character Hamlet would be impossible if there were not Horatio, his poor servant ever, self-possessed and unpresuming, to whom the prince can speak without feigning or irony or contempt, who in turn can speak the simple and perfect blessing and farewell, and would die with Hamlet if the prince had not asked him to live on and serve him further. In their servanthood, these figures are not so much Christian as they are Christ-like. The dignity of their courage and generosity, so costly to themselves, epitomizes the deep core of value the civilization had claimed for a millennium and more, a fierce, barbarous civilization, but with an ember of beauty at the center of it, for which our egalitarianism and our pride have perhaps denied us a name. Then again, our egalitarianism was once inspired by this early recognition of the high dignity of the servant, the saving paradox at the heart of wild old Christendom. Thank you.
Well, Jeff.
You certainly may.
Thank you so much. When you're done, do you want to call on hands or want me to?
Oh, I'll be fine. As a respondent today, I find myself in a doubly tricky situation. First, I have to overcome feeling awestruck by Marilynne Robinson. And second, I have to come up with something more than that I completely agree with her. Yet I do agree completely with the central principle of her talk, which is that history is not merely change and fragmentation, it's also continuity. For Professor Robinson, the failure of modern scholars to appreciate the continuity between the religion of the New World and the religion of the Old resembles their failure to appreciate the clear line of English Reform thinking that stretches from the medieval writings of John Wycliffe to the Reformation proper. This intellectual tradition of Reformation, Professor Robinson believes, also helps explain a somewhat different form of continuity, the special connection between Shakespeare and his audience. How, in Professor Robinson's terms, could Shakespeare have possessed, quote, more weight and subtlety as a writer than we grant any theologian or philosopher, and yet have been so immensely, indeed uniquely popular in his own time? Professor Robinson proposes that Shakespeare and his audience must have shared, quote, a robust conceptual frame so strong and well established that it was capable of serving as a medium for ideas of great complexity. This common framework, she believes, was the Wycliffite tradition. But why should the medium for ideas that Shakespeare shared with his audience be limited to Wycliffite thought in particular? Why not call it Renaissance English culture generally, or only a little less generally, Christianity? Professor Robinson maintains that the officially banned Wycliffite tradition survived, quote, underground in England, and there's a strong temptation in such theories of clandestine transmission to attribute the intellectual congruencies between disparate writers or periods to a special hidden line of thinking rather than to an open and general one. This is the temptation to which the intellectual historian Frances Yates famously succumbed when she explained all the similarities in the Renaissance writers she admired as the result of their secret adherence to an ancient Hermetic tradition, the occult philosophy, she called it. Nevertheless, Professor Robinson does have some strong reasons for tracing Shakespeare's broad appeal as a playwright to Wycliffe. As Professor Robinson explains, Wycliffe and his followers were inclusivists. They refused to think of Christianity as the special province of the priesthood or of theologians or of those who understood Latin. They wanted, quote, to broaden access to the Bible and to Christianity generally because, as Professor Robinson puts it, they believed, quote, in the dignity and value of the human person without reference to status or condition. According to Professor Robinson, it was above all this commitment to individual human dignity that Shakespeare shared with his audience. His success as an entertainer, Professor Robinson implies, depended on the serendipitous connection between these Wycliffite principles and his own character. Shakespeare himself, she asserts, was no sectarian. He was rather broadly and impartially engaged in the intellectual ferment of his day. But the spirit of inclusiveness that Professor Robinson detects in Shakespeare and his audience was not confined to the Wycliffite tradition in England or to English religious thought or even to European Protestantism at large. Inclusiveness was a central principle for the most famous humanist in 16th century Europe, a writer who remained a Catholic to his dying day, Erasmus. In the preface to his Paraclesis, translated into English in 1529, Erasmus exhorted his readers not to identify Christianity with a complex system of beliefs and thus effectively, quote, appropriate unto a few men that thing which Christ would have most common. Only a very few of us can be learned, but all can be Christian. For the Wycliffites, as Professor Robinson notes, the overriding importance of opening Christianity to the poor and unlearned, as well as to the rich and educated, led to a piety, quote, centered on the 10 Commandments. Yet such doctrinal minimalism was a constant theme for Erasmus, too. In his Enchiridion, translated into English in 1533, he declared that the essential matter of Christian doctrine can and should be contained, quote, in a few articles only. As he later explained in one of his epistles, a truly Catholic church should insist only on those articles of faith that are, quote, clearly laid down in Holy Writ, or without which the system of our salvation cannot stand. For this, a few truths suffice, and the multitude are more easily persuaded of their truth if they are few. English reformers such as Fox and Hooker regularly expressed similar views, often explicitly citing the Catholic Erasmus as an authority for their beliefs. If we all recognize that our salvation depended on a few truths only, these Protestants reasoned, along with Erasmus, we would do more than open Christianity to everyone. We would also expose the pointlessness of the sectarian wars within Christianity. In 1624, Bishop James Ussher declared that if we should compare, quote, all the several professions of Christianity in the world and put by the points wherein they differ from one another and gather into one body the rest of the articles wherein they all did generally agree, we should find that in those propositions which without all controversy are universally received in the Christian world, so much truth is contained as being joined with holy obedience may be sufficient to bring a man unto everlasting salvation. For all its professions of inclusiveness, of course, the English church had serious limits on how far it was willing to open its doors. The idea that the commercial theater might be used as a platform for helping to spread gospel truths was anathema to most Renaissance clergy and to many lay writers of the period as well. They argued that representing Christianity on the stage would only debase it, not broaden access to it. By 1606, this opposition to a religious theater had grown so strong that Shakespeare and his fellow playwrights were forbidden even to use the word God in their plays. But the doctrinal minimalism that flowed through English culture from many sources, including Wycliffe and Erasmus, helped playwrights such as Shakespeare turn this ban on overt proselytizing from the stage into a seeming gain for the theater. A truly open Christianity, these playwrights suggested time and again, must concern itself more with fellowship than with doctrine. And the only limit the theater placed on those who wished to join the fellowship of playgoers was the price of a penny's entrance fee. When Shakespeare's chief rival as a dramatist, Ben Jonson, pictured the communion of the saved that he hoped to find in heaven, he envisioned, quote, all the happy souls that ever were as meeting with gladness not in a church, but in one theater. Professor Robinson is surely right to challenge the notion that Shakespeare and his fellow dramatists nonetheless divided their plays to match the class divisions in their audiences, providing one sort of entertainment to one set of playgoers and another sort to another set, the deep parts of the plays, as she says, for the sophisticates, and the clowns and sword fights for the plebs. Every member of the audience saw the same play as everyone else. But the theory that Professor Robinson disputes is not merely a modern simplification. Plenty of Renaissance commentators conceived of plays in these divided terms. Take Prince Hamlet, for instance. The only playgoers who matter, he twice insists, are the elite few with whom the prince, as prince, identifies. Against these cognoscenti, he sets the barren spectators who laugh at clowns, Polonius, who wants a jig or a tale of bawdry or he sleeps, and of course, the groundlings, who for the most part are capable of nothing but inexplicable dumb shows and noise. Over the course of his own play, however, Prince Hamlet seriously weakens his theory of high for high and low for low in the theater by himself becoming a clown. He recognizes the problem. He claims that he has been, quote, distracted, that is, pulled into pieces by his woes. According to King Claudius, however, Hamlet had always been immensely popular with the very people whose judgment Hamlet claims to deplore. The million, as Hamlet calls them, or as Claudius calls them, the distracted multitude. Professor Robinson's central point about Shakespeare seems to me as completely persuasive as her central point about historical continuity. A spirit of egalitarianism does indeed pervade Shakespeare's plays. But Shakespeare, I think, regards the consequences of this egalitarianism as more unsettling than Professor Robinson suggests. If we all share all parts of plays, the lofty and inspiring as well as the coarse and vulgar, then we must all, each of us, be more complex than we imagined. Not just complex, divided, distracted, insofar as the same play pulls each of us in different directions simultaneously. What we truly share, Shakespeare seems to have believed, are these self-divisions, and his contemporary admirers repeatedly credited him with the ability to make us feel Hamlet's distraction in ourselves. The comedian rides through Shakespeare's tragedies even as the tragedian stands on tiptoe, wrote one such admirer in 1604. Observe his comic vein and laugh. Proceed next to a tragic strain, then weep, wrote another in 1632. So when thou find'st two contraries, two different passions from thy rapt soul rise, then say that you've seen Shakespeare to the life. Thank you.
Would you first like to say anything about Jeff's comments?
Thank you very much. I think that the difference between his approach and mine might be that he uses generalized terms like Renaissance clergy, when in fact they were bitterly, bitterly divided and had what in many cases were such entrenched religious positions that they were speaking at cross purposes often. So to say certain Renaissance clergy thought thus and so, certain Renaissance clergy thought exactly the opposite. That's why people had that tendency to burn one another during the period. That as a method, that would be my major objection. Also, I have just been reading things that were published and that Shakespeare used and so on, and I don't find Erasmus among them. He certainly did share many things with the Reformation thinkers, and many people in the Reformation were kind of amazed that he never changed sides. But you can say one thing which is true, which is that there are always people on both sides of any issue that share things, that share assumptions. But it's another thing to say that Wycliffe on one hand and Erasmus on the other can be assumed to be equal influences on the culture that Shakespeare addressed. I don't know when you read what was being printed and what was being bought, I don't find him there. you know. On the other hand, what you get is a huge upsurge of a version of nationalism that is based on common law. You know, the Magna Carta is such a fellow, he will have no monarch, you know. And the use of English, the use of the vernacular language, these things were very much associated. And the rise of English as a literary language, which is simultaneous with other things that were happening on the continent, is associated with writers who were dissidents, who were profoundly critical of the established order. So I don't think there's any reason to dismiss the idea that there was an unarticulated and uncountenanced culture from the point of view of who would be censored and in what way and so on. It wasn't until 1640 that censorship ceased to be effective, and it was effective again in 1660. But in that period, you know, where you have censorship as an established policy of the government, then of course you have what is not printed, what is not, permitted. And when censorship stops and you start getting, the penalties fall away simply because of disorder in the government and political changes of opinion and so on, then you find out what there was there, you know. I think that there's the tendency to talk about Renaissance England as if it were monolithic, when the immediate history of England demonstrated that it was on the verge of revolution, and that it was a popular and theologically Wycliffite Calvinist sort of position that was taken and won militarily. I think that you're erasing away things that are incredibly important to the history, not only of England in the Renaissance and Reformation, but New England, which is basically spun off from the side of the English Civil War.
I think it's important to stress that the clergy were not monolithic. At the same time, that's why I emphasize Erasmus. Erasmus is a Catholic, and in 1547, by law, all English churches were supposed to have a copy of Erasmus's paraphrases available. Erasmus, a Catholic, have his paraphrases available in every English Protestant church. But I don't want to argue that it was actually Erasmus rather than Wycliffe, or actually Erasmus rather than Calvin, who was the most important figure for the period. I'm trying to emphasize, I think, that there is a broad agreement across sectarian divides that's appreciated by a number of the most important English theologians. And they take this broad agreement as the rationale for what's called the Elizabethan settlement in religion. That is, we're not going to impose Protestantism on everybody in the way that the Inquisition wants to impose Catholicism on everybody. We'll let you believe what you want to believe, the church keeps saying. Just show up to church. That'll be fine. You can be what the period called church papist. You can be a papist in your heart, a Catholic in your heart, just conform outwardly and everything will be fine, because we figure once you listen to us, once you listen to the truth, you'll be slowly but surely convinced by us to change. So we can allow Catholics as well as Protestants into our church. That's how broad-minded we see ourselves to be. What the sad irony of this emphasis on a kind of broad agreement across sects is that it led to the deepest divide in English theology. That is, the divide between what are now called Anglicans and Puritans, as they were called by their Anglican opponents. That is, there were certain clergy who refused to accept that there was broad agreement, who hated the influence of Catholicism on English Protestantism and wanted there to be a purer Reformation. And these Puritans were scorned by the people who were in favor of broad agreement. Therefore, they tried to repress the people who disagreed with them and when they insisted that everybody agreed, and created more disagreement as a result of their refusal to allow the people who disagreed with them into the church they believed was based on agreement.
I think that the degree of reconciliation that the Elizabethan settlement brought about is easily overstated. One of the things that Elizabeth did, which was, shrewd in her style, was that she redefined recusant Catholicism as treason. And so she could say that she never burned anyone for religious difference, for heresy. But for treason, she eviscerated a good number of Catholics. I don't know how many, hundreds. So that's Elizabethan tolerance, And it's, that's one of those terms that's easily overstated. In order to make the Book of Common Prayer accepted in Cornwall, they killed 3,000 people who resisted it. We idealize that period. It was actually incredibly violent, and most of the things that were called tolerance and so on, there's very ironic use of the word.
That's absolutely true. And the what's interesting about the history of the English inability to live up to the tolerant ideology of the church was the transformation of the church antagonism from being against Catholics to being against fellow Protestants. So it became more and more divided even within the sect of Protestantism over the course of the Renaissance, so that the most persecuted members of the society were Puritans, were fellow Protestants rather than Catholics. But I think it's interesting that a lot of playwrights felt that the theater was therefore a better place to realize this sensibility of toleration than the church was, because there was no emphasis on doctrine, because we're not allowed to talk about doctrine. Therefore, the one thing we can truly say we share is fellowship, a kind of sacramental sense of fellowship amongst us. What's more, we can tolerate people the church cannot tolerate. We can tolerate the rakehells, the profligates, the masterless men that the church wants no part of. We'll let you in. And we're better suited to be able to convert you than the church is, because the church can't speak in your rakehell profligate terms. We can. So the theater becomes a place where the playwrights believe the toleration that's given lip service by the church can actually be realized.
One of the things that I would just interject is that in Calvin's writing, he regularly refers to creation as a theater. It is the theater of God's glory. And he refers to human beings as actors on stages whose audience is God, to see, watching to see how well one performs, in effect, So the metaphor of theater, and then, of course, there is the fact that that first play, that Abraham Sacrificing, was written in Geneva by his closest associate. So the theater did not, perhaps part of the reason for the greatness of the theater in that period was because the metaphor, which I think is very suggestive, that it can mean the world, the globe, the cosmos, has a very strong theological content, So in other words, the idea that Puritans were anti-theater when the English authorities closed the theater whenever they felt like it, and had always done so for as long as there was a theater, and arrested actors, as we know, which is why Shakespeare had to wear a servant's vestments and so on. The idea of the very high respectability of the theater as metaphor comes out of Calvin.
Maybe you're thinking about something to say, but in the meantime, I also want to invite other people, if you have questions and want to join in the conversation.
There's a lady.
Where? Oh, yes, please.
One of the things this is making me think about is the relationship of the professor term himself as a priest in terms of interpreting the Shakespearean text, in the sense of
that students see professors as the priests or the ministers who interpret the sacred text, which is Shakespeare. And I was thinking about that when you were speaking, and I did want to go back to the question that Professor Robinson, or the point that she raised at the beginning, that the Book of Martyrs was the second best-selling book in I think 16th century England. And I guess, again, it's the question of audience, isn't it, in terms of how do we define Shakespeare's audience? What is it that they were reading? And that's the question, that's the sort of Erasmus question, too. That's when Professor Knapp raised that, I was thinking about, yes, well, who is reading Erasmus? And I realized that from our period, we're looking back and we're just getting flotsam and jetsam in terms of material data. But I guess I would want to know, I would want to think about just who, again, about this question of who's reading what in Shakespeare's day, and about the constitution of his own audience and what they were reading, and to think, yeah, I guess I'll just stop there and ask if you can speak a little bit more about Erasmus in terms of his popularity, not just for a learned group, but in terms of any kind of popular appeal.
Is that addressed to me?
That's actually addressed to Professor Knapp, but I just wanted to say that to you that question of the servant is, I think it's a really fascinating thesis to have us rethink the question of the servant from our own American point of view, where the servant doesn't have the same role that it did now as then.
Well, I just want to say bless you for that question as a professor to the student. It's another way in which the theater imagines itself as more accommodative to its audience than the church is that you don't have to be literate to attend it and to enjoy it. It's an amazing change in the English church of the time that there's a Book of Common Prayer that you can read along and join in with the priest and be a part of the service and feel that it belongs to you all. But for Shakespeare, you don't have to read it all. And so the theater is a way of disseminating these beliefs without books, even though they're part of books. They become books.
I think that one of the ways that you can get a sense of what Shakespeare would have been reading is, or what he assumed his audience would have been reading, is by what he dramatized. I mean, he virtually always has a freshly translated text, or John Gower, for example, who wrote in Middle English. He was a contemporary of Chaucer, Richard II. But people. The emergence of books as accessible things that was occasioned by the printing press, which vastly cheapened the cost of a book, meant that people could read to each other, they could share books, they could, teach each other on the basis of books that were easily accessible. He used North's Plutarch. He used, tremendous numbers of texts that we know would have just come into print. I think that, part of it would be like making a movie out of Gone with the Wind, and part of it would be if a book was being talked about, then you want to see it. You want to see it dramatized, Though
I think there's also on Shakespeare's part a deep distrust of books. That is to say, of books as a chief vehicle for learning and education. You may remember that in The Tempest when Stephano and Trinculo are joking and they want to swear in the book. The book is actually a flask of wine. And Prospero buries his book at the end of the play. Books are, in Shakespeare's view, inherently elitist, because there are just certain people who are literate and certain people aren't. And what's great about the theater is the way in which it can transform books into something that's more broadly shared.
But, to talk about these things as if it was a static situation, I think, is an error. Literacy was spreading like wildfire in England at that time. There were more literate, the level of literacy was higher in the English Renaissance than it was in the 19th century in England, partly because of, taxing books and so on, making education less, prevalent. At the same time that in New England, the literacy rate was higher than anything we've attained subsequently. Literacy was very much associated with access to books in the common language. So, I don't think that Shakespeare was dealing with a public who could assume to be largely illiterate. I think he was dealing with a public that was very excited by the fact that books were available and that people were learning to read them at a terrific rate and drawing huge world historical conclusions from what they read. I mean, the Reformation Renaissance in England was as dynamic a historical moment as you will ever find anywhere, and it had directly to do with the spread of literacy.
But another way to put the relationship of the theater to the book is not that Shakespeare is differentiating or opposing the theater to the book, because plays had a double life. They were on the stage, but they were also published as books. And a recent study by a guy named Lucas Earn has shown that Shakespeare was far and away the most published playwright of his day. And even as he was writing, his plays were being published, so that during his lifetime, 1 out of 6 of the plays published in England were Shakespeare plays. So he knows that his plays are being published, that they have this double life, and it's a little like the double life of plays in something like Hamlet. As the fact that there's popular elements to the play doesn't erase the elite elements of the play, neither do the elite elements erase the popular elements. And Shakespeare thinks that's more complicated than you think. It's not as if the broad audience that I have of both the elite and the plebs makes me simply broad in a monolithic sense. It makes me divided, and it makes you divided insofar as you find an appeal from both sides of my plays.
May I ask a slightly different kind of question? I find myself thinking about Lila, learning to become literate by copying over text. And I'm finding myself thinking about your novels through the prism of The Servant now and rethinking them all. So unless you'd like to defer this question until this evening, I was wondering how this idea of The Servant informs something about what you're trying to do in your fictional work.
I think you're probably right. Never thought of it in just those terms, but I like to feel that I have an essential person. You know what I mean? I don't want my characters, or the ones that are central for me, to come cluttering into onto the page with appurtenances and degrees and all the rest of them. I want to feel that they are the, unaccommodated human being, And I think that model slides over very readily into the idea of the servant, who's basically taken down to the question of conscience, really, or, a special kind of self-awareness that is presumptively generous, but cannot make claims for itself relative to other people, I think that's true.
So going back to housekeeping, well, maybe you weren't thinking about this in the end, the crossing over of the bridge, there was a feeling that this human being was giving herself over to some larger something. And I don't know if servitude has something to do with that, but there was no, to me then, and even now rereading it, there was no theological component, but it felt like a giving over to a force and disappearing into the mystery.
I think that Lila and housekeeping are similar in the sense that I'm not trying to imply a kind of pantheism or anything as obvious as that, but that there is a profound, one might say, perhaps be forgiven for saying an intelligent other that permeates reality. I read scientific things as they, land on my desk or whatever. And I was reading about viruses the other day, and how, I was, there was an article and it was under the heading science. But it's very beautiful because these things, they can't even securely identify them as living or not living. They have a speck of genome, nothing, they have nothing about them that we would associate with intelligence or agency or anything like that. And as they behave in the world, they are perfectly brilliant. week, you know? And, you know, you think we have to, in some way, have misconstrued things very radically to think that something that has none of our defined mechanisms for intelligence, agency, selfhood, all the rest, can exist in these pervasively present creatures or whatever, that, you know what I mean? What I'm saying is that I feel that reality itself is saturated with something that it's crude to call intelligence, but I can't think of another word. I mean, if you read about subatomic phenomena, or you read about what happens when a wound heals, or, you know, it looks as if there's a deeper intelligence below the level of our awareness than anything that we have attained to, except insofar as we harbor viruses and heal, you know? And I want that sense of the world in my writing because I don't believe in anything else. I mean, I don't believe that the world is stupid. I don't believe that the world is material in a dismissive sense. And so, you know, that's always present. It's present in housekeeping.
That's striking, if I may, because Lila, and it was Lucy, right, who wanders off to Boston?
Lucille, right.
Lucille. I would describe it in many ways, but the first word that come to mind would not be intelligent. I don't mean they're stupid, but there are other things much more vividly than intelligent. And I'm wondering if that feeling of there being intelligence out there is somehow comes across in proportion to these characters they somehow feel porous with the world. They don't feel completely in control, cognitively demanding.
Good.
Good? A minus.
Can I respond to a few of those points? One that I think your point about the virus as giving you a sense of an intelligence that's inside of you that's not you is that would be congenial to Shakespeare. We know it as in Freud's account of us that there are numbers of cells within us. There's an id and superego that aren't in our control, that are nonetheless inside of us. And for Shakespeare, I think that suggests how, again, everybody's more complex than you think, but what it means to be complex is that you aren't you, that inside of you is a you that's not you. And actually, servants are as likely to feel that in Shakespeare as royalty. You think that royalty will only feel it because the rich are complex, because they know more, they're more interesting people. The king is officially complex insofar as he's both himself, the king, and also the king with a capital K, this legal entity. That's why he refers to himself as a we. But servants in Shakespeare are equally divided in this way because they are themselves, and they also derive their identity from the lord they follow. And for Iago is talking to Rodrigo at the beginning of Othello and says, you know, I hate them more. You can be sure of that. And then Rodrigo says, well, why do you follow him? And he said, oh, I follow him but to serve my turn upon him. So I'm serving him, I'm serving myself. Well, that's a complicated idea because he thinks that in serving him, if I show that I serve him falsely, then I believe that I have some soul because I can see, insofar as I'm only pretending to be connected to him, that I really care about myself. However you take it, however much you believe Iago's account, he feels that he's divided because of his service. And Shakespeare thinks that's true. Service shows you that even for the poor, this kind of division we grant to the rich is true.
This makes me feel better about myself, I have to say.
I would like to comment that the distinction that we make rich and poor and educated and uneducated would not be appropriate in Renaissance terms. A lot of aristocracy were just as ignorant as they could be, and a lot of very middle-class people, very lower-class people, they had the Bible, they had things like that from which they developed ideas of history, authority, all sorts of things. You know, the debates about the legitimacy of kings, those debates are overwhelmingly governed by the history contained in the Old Testament. So they were often, it was dangerous. You know, according to Christopher Hill, there was a time when if you knew the Ten Commandments, that was proof of heresy if you were a lower class person. But So they had to be very discreet about what they knew. And they were reading books that if they were reading the Bible, they were reading books that were smuggled in from the continent, that it was not legal to own and that you could be burned for owning. So on the one hand, they're not going to flaunt their learning, at least till they build up a kind of critical mass of popular opinion. But on the other hand, they can never be assumed to be less educated or narrower in their thinking than people of a higher class.
And indeed, the theater is a mechanism for educating the people, because what's distinctive about the theater, just shortly before Shakespeare's time, but throughout his career, is that there had been no purpose-built permanent theaters in Europe since Roman times until they were built shortly before Shakespeare's birth. So instead of players going on tour, and therefore people hearing a play only, say, once a year at best as the players came through your town, now you had acting companies who were stationed in London, which meant that you could have a returning audience who were becoming increasingly more sophisticated about the plays because they're coming back again and again to see plays. In fact, according to the authorities, coming back daily to see the plays. And as Professor Robinson was saying, getting educated in the ways of the court, not by knowing about the court directly, but through Shakespeare's plays.
Yeah, we'll take one last question. Just a note, our appreciation for helping to rescue Puritanism from our doggedly stereotyping of it. Mencken's definition of Puritan is a person has the uneasy feeling that someone somewhere may be happy, which is how we tend to think of it. The question is, to what extent did was Wycliffe influential, and was Shakespeare aware of the idea both of the servant in Isaiah and Christ teaching his disciples that he who is greatest is a servant of all, and that idea is which seems at the core of Christianity, that ultimately it is the servant who in the kingdom of God is seen as the highest.
Shakespeare had access to the whole Bible, and he would typically have read the Geneva Bible. I mean, because the King James Version, as we call it, didn't come out until 1611. But, I mean, there's no reason to imagine that he would not have known anything that the Bible basically could have contained. As far as H.L. Mencken is concerned, he also said there's nothing in the world sadder than a black man who has been educated. He also said that if women are educated, men will become unnecessary. I think I think that H.L. Mencken should definitely be chiseled out of our pantheon. They lately found letters of his that were very anti-Semitic, and that has caused his reputation to plunge. But it's so predictable that he would have been, because he had the same antagonisms. You know what I mean? They're right. It's like a deck of cards. If you know there's one, if there's another. I read him at length, just to try to figure out what in the world was going on. But he's a very important former of American thought, and he's been very destructive.
And not only were people who read the Bible, but many more people reading the Bible than before, because there's more literacy and there's more vernacular Bibles, but also the Puritans themselves were distinguished by their commitment to preaching above all during the time. And what preaching meant was trying to educate the people in the Bible, in the Scripture. So both, again, the theater side, which has been associated with Anglicanism, and the Puritan side, associated with preaching, are committed to the same goal, which is broadening access to Christianity.
I would object.
Is there evidence that Shakespeare, like Twain with Huck Finn, is kind of aware of that dominant Christian idea, or Isaiah Christian, is there any evidence that he's actually suggesting that these noble servants really are kind of Christ-like figures?
Let me think. I think it's simply, it is implicit, and they are self-sacrificing figures of great generosity and kindness. Cleopatra's maids go with her, Kent will not outlive Lear, and so on. And Horatio does not want to outlive Hamlet, and, you know, I mean, when you see Horatio, the dignity that he gives to Hamlet, that would not be accessible to him if he had only Osric and Claudius and so on to interact with. He can realize himself simply because of the servanthood and of Horatio, using that in the best sense, using that in the most positive sense. And you do have Osric as the foil of the feigned subservience that is utterly despicable, you know?
Another way to think about it would be to look at the kings who are most successful in Shakespeare. And so Henry V, Hal, is the most miraculously successful of all his kings and gets 3, 4, 5 plays about him in Shakespeare's career. And he's successful because he's away from the court. He's not hanging out with the aristocracy. He's hanging out with all these good fellows. Good fellows are, you know, roisterers, swaggerers, drunkards, the sorts of people that Falstaff and his crew, Henry seems to enjoy, Hal. And yet it's his debasing himself this way which makes him end up being the most powerful of the kings.
Yeah, he hangs Bardolph.
Invitation to come this evening. I want to thank you both very much.